When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?
These are the words of John Ball, a radical 14th century preacher. It's a cry for equality.
In 1381, England was a tinderbox ready to explode. New thoughts and ideas were stoked by a chain reaction of disasters.
There's pandemic, there's wage suppression, there's war in Europe and uncertainty around government. All of that might sound quite familiar to us nowadays.
As relentless catastrophes engulfed the country, the discontent drove thousands of ordinary people to join the first popular rebellion in English history. But who were these people? Where did they come from? And what drove them to rebel? In this series, I'm following the route of the rebels from countryside to capital, and exploring exciting new evidence that lifts the lid on this medieval revolution. Evidence which reveals the truth about the men and women who rebelled in the long, hot summer of 1381.
This is the hidden story of the real people behind the Peasants Revolt.
In the late 14th century, England's towns and cities were growing, but most people still lived in the countryside, although this wasn't as idyllic as we might imagine. Most of the century had been punctuated by catastrophe after catastrophe, and by 1381, life was only getting harder. In spring, sporadic rioting broke out in Winchester, Salisbury, Shrewsbury, and York.
In Oxfordshire, a man named William Payable, a slightly unfortunate name for a tax collector, was beaten almost to death trying to gather in money that was owed. England was unsettled, and taxation was to be the spark that would ignite a tinder-dry nation into a summer of bloody violence.
This was still a feudal world where the authorities were rarely challenged from below, but the times were changing fast. The old order was about to get a very rude awakening. Things started to get really out of hand in the east, in Brentwood, Essex.
Thomas Bampton, a royal tax commissioner, rolled into town. He'd summoned all of the men from the local villages to attend a meeting with him. I imagine him beginning full of pomposity and all of his own self-importance to tell them that he was here to collect more taxation. But he didn't get very far. Thomas Baker from the nearby village of Fobbing stepped forward and stopped Bampton abruptly. Essex, he said, had paid its share and they'd pay no more. Bampton ordered the arrest of Baker and dozens of others who joined in with his protest. The men drew their weapons and strung their bows, and Bampton was forced to withdraw with his tail between his legs. If anyone thought that was the end of the matter, they were to be sorely mistaken.
The history books often tell us that 1381 was all about angry peasants. But what exactly is a medieval peasant, and why were they revolting? We don't have any portraits other than for royals and aristocrats from this period, so to help us with our investigation, we've reimagined the faces of the people prepared to rise against the establishment. I'm in Cosmeston Medieval Village, a living history centre based on the remains of a 14th century village rediscovered here in the 1980s. It recreates the period of the revolt and lets us get closer to what life was like as a peasant in those bristling days of the summer of 1381.
So, Eleanor, what is a medieval peasant?
The answer is almost everybody. So we estimate about 80 to 85% of the entire medieval European population are peasants. And that literally just means that they're farmers.
Someone who knows all about the life of these people is peasant megafan and 14th century expert Dr. Eleanor Yarniger.
And I think people have these two different ideas of what medieval peasant life was maybe like, that it was either backbreaking, non-stop work for all of eternity, or it was this rustic idyll where you're free in the countryside, barely doing anything.
Yeah, I think that rustic idyll kind of idea comes from places like this, where we come and have an idea about what it might be like to be a peasant, and that's not quite what the case is. It's really hard to be a farmer. It's a lot of work. Having said that, because almost everyone in the Middle Ages is a peasant of some description, there's a lot of different ways to be a peasant. So you can be an incredibly wealthy peasant who has lots of land, who has a staff and servants. You can be a middle-class peasant who quite well to do, but about 50% of all peasants, at least here in England, were probably quite poor. So you're doing subsistence farming, you need to be out in the field day in, day out, looking after your animals, doing your own plowing, and you're kind of living hand to mouth. So there's a lot of different ways to be experiencing life.
It's interesting that peasants might have servants, though. Where does this fit into our idea of the feudal triangle that is quite compact and...
Well, I mean, this is the thing about the feudal triangle. It's not real. And the term feudal is something that historians are really moving away from using, because there's this idea that you've got the king at the top, some lords in the middle, and then peasants down the bottom. But the truth is much more complex than that. So you can have some peasants who are actually much wealthier than other people who are technically nobles, because they might not have a lot of land or a lot of way of raising taxation. But the truth is a lot more kind of like a big mess and a little less like a pyramid.
Yeah. And what would be the difference between someone who is a free peasant and someone who is unfree?
So this is one of the big differences, because those wealthier peasants a lot of the time are free men. So they're much more able to accumulate land, accumulate servants, go to market with their goods. Serfs are going to be more like the lower class of peasants, and they are tied to the land. So, no matter what, if you think that there's an opportunity to buy a bigger piece of land down the road, doesn't matter, because you're owned by your lord, you're tied to the land, and you can't move. You have to ask permission for all sorts of different things. So the wealthier class, that's a freeman, they're paying tax, things like that. Poorer classes, that's a serf, and they're struggling really hard to get by.
And quite often the 14th century is framed as one of the worst centuries to be alive in human history, maybe. What are some of the things that are going on in England that are making life difficult?
Well, first off, you've got the Great Famine. And this happens kind of about the 30s or so in the 14th century. There is a series of bad winters where we have incredibly terrible rain, everything floods, the crops don't grow, which means that the livestock start dying. This happens for 3 years in a row, and there's a huge mortality as a result of it. Then when things are finally starting to recover from that, you're hit with the Black Death. And, in rural places, it's a little bit better. In London, it can be a little bit worse because people are on top of each other, but still, you lose about 25% of the entire population. And then, just when that's over, you've got the 100 Years' War kicks off. And suddenly, you've got a king telling everyone that they've got to go over to France to fight.
So was there, in 1381, a straw that breaks the camel's back?
Yeah, in my opinion, it's taxes, and more specifically, poll taxes, which is a whole new kettle of fish. And if you think about it, you've just had 25% of everyone die. You're coming off of a terrible famine. There's all these opportunities actually for new economic growth because there are fewer people around, but you're being specifically told you're not allowed to have that, and also go pay for some rich guy's weird war in France. It's a lot to take in.
So how did medieval taxes actually work?
A lot more physically than our own. Actually, over here, we have a tithe barn, so I can give you a visual demonstration of how it works. Okay, so welcome to our tithe barn.
So what is a tithe barn?
So this is essentially where the normal taxes that everybody paid would be collected. And as you can kind of tell from the crosses behind here, that's your tithe that you pay to your church. So it's kind of initially a quasi-religious place because a monk's gonna kind of come through, rifle through all your stuff and ask you to pay something in. They're going to be keeping their records back here so they know exactly what it is that you're supposed to be paying. This then kind of gets repurposed later on by taxation authorities from the crown. Because if you already have a place that people are paying taxes into, it's really easy to just retrofit that for your own uses.
So the church's tax office becomes the government tax office?
Exactly.
The tithe is a church tax, which was taken yearly at harvest time. It was 10% of your income and would usually be gathered in a barn, so you can pay in produce instead of cash if needed. In addition to the tithe, there were government taxes, but these were irregular and only raised for things like foreign wars. There'd been a lot recently though, as England was right in the middle of the incredibly expensive 100 Years' War against France.
So Eleanor, if I'm a normal peasant, how am I going to pay my taxes?
The normal kind of tax that you would expect to pay is called a fractional tax. So every couple of years, a tax collector is going to come around to your house and he's going to assess what we call your movable goods. So here's your cash. He's going to have a look at it. He's going to take an idea of what that is worth, and he's going to ask you to pay a percentage of that. If you are poorer, you only own 10 pounds worth of things, you're going to be paying 1 pound, because that's 10%, right? It's not unlike what we would expect to see now from income taxes, and it kicks in only when you've got more money.
But it does seem reasonably fair.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you consider that these are taxes for largely nothing, then, fair enough. Now, obviously, if you were trying to run a war that lasts for over 100 years, though, this isn't going to do you any good. So the kings are looking at this and saying, how do I get more money out of everyone? And this is when they institute a new thing, and that is called the poll tax. And this is a terrible thing because the poll tax essentially says every single person in society over the age of 16 has to pay a certain flat rate.
The first poll tax set a flat rate of 4p for everybody over 14 years of age. That's a day or two's wages for a labourer, but virtually nothing to a nobleman. It didn't raise as much as expected, but some wealthy clergy voluntarily paid more. In 1379, a second poll tax was introduced. It was much more progressive, with 33 layers of payment. It was still a flat rate, but it sought to build on the overpayment by wealthy clergy last time. Payments ranged from £6, 13 shillings and 4p for the richest to 4p for the poorest. But it was a failure. People refused to pay, and the population magically shrunk as people hid family members from tax collectors. So by 1380, more taxation was needed.
So what next? Do we go back to a fractional tax? What do we do?
Oh, chance would be a fine thing. So at this point, you have the 1381 poll tax, which is another flat tax, which makes it worse because this time it is 12p for every single person over the age of 16. This is an absolutely crushing burden on regular people. And you get a pretty good idea of how terrible a burden this is because everyone just decides, never mind, we're going into open revolt.
So in 1381, they take the worst version of the taxation that we've just heard before, and they make it worse.
That's right. It's basically like, oh, well, maybe if we do it harder, it'll work this time. And you've got to understand at this point, these people are in fear for their lives. This is so much money that they are absolutely suffering. If you revolt as a peasant, you are literally risking life and death. Lords will absolutely kill you for this. So you don't do it unless you feel you have no other option. And that gives you a really good idea of why they're willing to actually revolt.
So it's June 1381, Eleanor. Are you revolting?
Absolutely. If I am alive in 1381, I'm obviously a disciple of the preacher John Wycliffe, and this is what he has to say about it. The rich do much to rob the poor from unreasonable taxes. They perish from hunger and thirst and cold. In this way, the lords do eat and drink the poor men's flesh and blood. And frankly, if you think that you're going to die of starvation because of taxes, you might roll the dice, risk it all, and see whether or not you can actually bring about a fairer world. Sorry, but if it's between starving to death and team killing a rich guy, I'm killing a rich guy.
As spring was turning to summer, revolt crackled in the air. Something had to change.
In the days that followed the events at Brentwood on the 30th of May, tensions grew to explosive levels. A meeting was organised in Thomas Baker's home village of Fobbing for anyone willing to make a stand. The date was set for Whit Sunday, the 2nd of June, and when it arrived, the response was overwhelming. Those who gathered began to organise themselves and to formulate a plan.
On the 4th of June 1381, the rebels in Essex crossed over the Thames estuary and led an attack on Lesnes Abbey in Kent. Now, even churches weren't safe.
The real target of these attacks was never money or jewels. It was the documents that defined life. These were the things that people felt oppressed by, that set in stone their position in society. These weren't written on stone, they were written on paper, and paper burns.
Destroying these records made it harder for the church and crown to control and tax people. As the destruction mounted, a coordinated revolt started to develop, something that required military know-how. Luckily, England was full of experienced soldiers and sailors, men home from the wars in France, people who knew how to fight. This is something that's often forgotten when looking at the so-called Peasants Revolt. Luckily, there's a team of investigative historians who've been on a quest to uncover more about the men and women at the heart of the revolt. The People of 1381 project has been digging deep into the archives to reveal how ordinary people around England were involved in and impacted by the revolt. We're going to be drawing on documents from criminal indictments to petitions for royal help. As we move through the story, we'll be discovering more from this treasure trove. The project's work will help us uncover the real histories behind the lost voices of the uprising. And to find out more, I'm heading to the National Archives to meet historian and project director Adrian Bell. So Adrian, what is the 1381 project and how did that come about?
People of 1381 is a project trying to expose all the information we've got on anyone who was connected with the famously named Peasants Revolt that happened in 1381. I was always worried about the revolt in the sense it's very successful. And they're so successful, I just wondered why, and no one really exposed why. And I thought it's because maybe a lot of the rebels have military experience. And in another project, I've got a huge list of names of soldiers. And I thought, could I compare this list of names with this list of names and find a connection? And that's what led us to then design this project.
This incredible 700-year-old document is a King's Bench prosecution roll, containing information on civil and criminal cases. It was rediscovered by 1381 project member Andrew Prescott after being hidden in a sack under the floorboards of Westminster Abbey before being moved to the National Archives. Now it's sadly too fragile for us to handle, but fortunately the People of 1381 project has digitised this document, keeping the stories of these people alive. People like Robert Hull.
So in this particular one, it gives us a really interesting story that we wouldn't have known otherwise, and it is about a military experienced soldier and sailor, a man called Robert Hull, who owned ships. And he was involved in military activities from 1355 right through to 1387, so a very long military career.
The document reveals the story of Robert Hull. He was convicted of trespass to person, abduction of a monk, raising the commons, forcing others to join company. Robert Hull, shipman of London, on Friday the 14th of June 1381, by force entered the aforesaid abbey and forced the said abbot to send one monk with them to London. Hull was a wealthy seaman with experience in war. In 1371, he had over £40 worth of goods at his home in London. This military man is far removed from our usual idea of a peasant. It's proof that active and former military men led the charge in the early days of the revolt. Was there a big military community in England who were kind of ready to be mobilised in 1381?
In terms of numbers, between 1370 and 1400, we know that 100,000 soldiers went to France. And you must remember this is a time when the population of England's quite small, so able-bodied men population would be quite small as well. We know also that everyone had to practice archery. We know that they're practicing the butts once a week, and we know that games were banned. Games such as football were banned. And then we also know, on top of that, that when we look at exchequer records, which are records that they take when rebels are actually prosecuted, lots of these records show that they owned armour, but also swords, daggers, bows and arrows, other weaponry. So there's a very heavily armoured society.
Presumably all of that experience makes a problem for the government. There are hundreds, thousands of men who are able to be in the right place at the right time, which makes the revolt much more
organised and therefore much more threatening for the government.
Yeah, it seems to be. We also have a number of mobile soldiers who we know have just come back from France. There's one man called John Pepper. He's been on campaign for about a year in France, who comes back to Falmouth just a couple of weeks before the revolt. He travels around Cambridgeshire on horseback with a pennant, bringing other people into the revolt. So acting like as a messenger, or definitely as someone who's organising or fomenting revolt.
It's easy to buy into the usual idea of a disorganised rabble running rampant through the countryside, but it's clear that the name Peasants Revolt is misleading. It makes it too easy to dismiss them as a naive rabble. The spark was spreading across the countryside. Towns and cities were burning, and so were the documents that held medieval society in place. The threat could no longer be ignored. Between the rebels and their mission stood one of the most dominant structures in the whole of England, Rochester Castle.
Rochester Castle is a strategically vital fortress that guards the River Medway and the old Roman road of Watling Street. The rebels pushed their way through the gates and made straight for the keep. Just imagine all of those rebels pouring through these corridors, charging around the castle, trying to take control of it all. This was designed to withstand a siege from a huge army. Look at these narrow corridors, these thick walls, all of these levels that the rebels would have had to work their way up. How would you even take this castle if the garrison was trying to stop you? The castle's constable, Sir John Newington, was taken hostage by the rebels. There were stories in the sources that his wife and children were abducted too to ensure his good behaviour. And perhaps that explains why the rebels were able to take this huge castle quite so easily.
Another person of interest joined the revolt at Rochester. Joanna Ferrer and her husband John. Joanna would soon be described as one of the leaders of the rebellion. The involvement of so many women is another dimension of the Peasants' Revolt that often gets overlooked. People of 1381 project lead Helen Lacey has taken special interest in the women of the revolt.
Helen, what of the documents that the 1381 project have been looking at been able to tell us about the involvement of women?
Yeah, the women are involved in a lot of aspects of the revolt, but just in far lower numbers than men. In our database, we've got about over 350 women, and women are often recorded as helping or persuading men to act, rather than being the instigators, but there are a few notable exceptions.
One of these exceptions was Joanna Ferrer, whose name we can see here. She was active as a ringleader from the attack at Rochester onwards.
Why then do we tend to think about the revolt being a man's thing? It's a load of men who attack London in a kind of violent rampage.
I think there's this traditional narrative, isn't there, of sort of men marching on London, but actually there are a few women who stand out as being leaders as well. But it's that narrative that's endured and being taught in schools and so on. So one of the things that we want to do is reintroduce the names of women who, haven't been recognised for their involvement. And I think the records would systematically reduce the role of women because these are law court records for the most part. And I think women, it's less likely to want to prosecute women, or that men might agree to acquit them in a jury.
And do we see women being victims of the revolt as well?
Yeah, there are more women victims in our database than there are as accused as rebels. There are also 55 women who are pardoned as well for their involvement in the revolt, so they're in the pardon rolls. But there are victims who are landowners, so their land is attacked, or they've had money demanded from them.
We'll be looking at these documents again as the situation across England turns increasingly violent. We'll be focusing on some amazing stories collected by the People of 1381 project, as well as exploring how Joanna and other women had vital roles in the revolt, from ringleaders to victims, even being held as hostages, like the wife of John Newington.
What would become of Sir John Newington, and how would Joanna Ferrer become one of the leading figures of the revolt? As the numbers gathering began to swell, each person brought with them a reason to join this revolt, something that drove them to seek and fight for a better England. The next Flashpoint would be Canterbury.
The mob arrived in Canterbury on the 10th of June, the day after the attack on Rochester. Canterbury was both the county capital of Kent and the seat of the most powerful man in the English Church, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury.
Where better to look for all of those precious records of the greatest landowner in England than Canterbury's cathedral? The rebels thundered their way in, pushed their way into the Archbishop's rooms, but he wasn't there. What they found intensified their fury even further. The gold and the treasure that the Archbishop of Canterbury had accumulated. During these days of horror and hope, of murder and mayhem, a leader would emerge from amongst the rebels. We know very little about him, even though his name has become so closely associated with the revolt in the centuries that followed. That man was Wat Tyler. The only thing we really know for certain about Wat Tyler is that people were willing to follow him.
Two other leaders are widely associated with the revolt. Jack Straw is credited with leading the rebels of Essex, but his name only appears in one document 2 years later. The other man, John Ball, is easier to find. We heard from him at the start of this film, talking about Adam and Eve and demanding equality.
John Ball was a radical preacher who roamed Essex and East Anglia preaching against the wealth of the church. His manifesto fit perfectly with the aims of the rebels. Like many other political and religious leaders before and after him, he inspired hope for a better life. Ball had been identified as a heretic by the church as early as 1368. At that point, he was excommunicated by the Bishop of London, the largest landowner in Essex. That bishop was a man named Simon Sudbury.
Ball's sentence of excommunication was repeated at Canterbury in April 1381, but there's no concrete evidence to tie Ball directly to the revolt. He's merely an omnipresent figure who gives the rebellion its moral heart. But the uprising wasn't powered by peace and love. To overcome huge cathedrals and public spaces, leaders like Wat Tyler resorted to physical force. Medieval weapons expert Lee Warden is showing me the arms and armour the insurgents would have used.
So Lee, what might a medieval peasant have been wearing in 1381?
Probably something similar to what I've got on. But obviously, if they're anticipating going off to war and participating in a battle, you're going to want to get hold of as much protective equipment as possible. So padded jackets were cheap and quite common. They may even be able to get hold of some chainmail or something that may have been in their family for a few generations, whatever kind of helmet and head protection they can get. There are even some references to people wrapping their heads in rope to provide some form of protection for their heads.
Sounds a bit like a make do and mend effort to get into battle and something
absolutely.
that resembles armour. And what kind of weapons might they have been able to get their hands on too?
So one of the really common weapons that basically all peasants would have had access to is something like a hand axe. Axes were sort of ubiquitous in the Middle Ages. Every household would have one. They're really good at chopping wood, but they're also pretty good at chopping people, so it makes quite a handy weapon.
I guess the big advantage is you know how to use that. You use that every day at home. It's not a foreign object to you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also worth bearing in mind that a lot of the peasants, their lifestyle is a lot more sort of labour intensive. They would have been physically quite robust. A peasant swinging one of these at you, it's going to hit with a pretty good amount of impact. They also would have used tools that they would have converted. One of the tools that they would have definitely used is a bill hook. So bill hooks like this, traditionally used as tools for pruning trees and chopping branches down, but with some slight modifications, just adding a spike on the back, spike on the top, a couple more spikes just for good measure. It actually turns into a pretty versatile tool and weapon on the battlefield.
Is it heavy?
Have a go.
I guess even if it's got a bit of weight to it, it's something that they're used to using every day.
Yeah.
It's just putting it to a slightly different use than pruning a tree.
Definitely.
I already quite like this as an idea.
Yeah.
But I'm going to say there's one thing on the table that is really drawing my attention. That's
Sure.
this. Oh, crikey, that has got weight on the end of it. That's quite heavy.
So this is a flail. Originally, when these were tools, obviously they wouldn't have the spikes. Flails were used to thresh wheat, but similar to the billhook, it's a tool which can quite easily be converted into a very, very deadly weapon.
It's amazing what a good job these things can do for what are essentially modified everyday tools.
Yeah.
It's a really crude analogy, but I'm going to say it anyway. This strikes me as something like having a baseball bat and putting nails through it.
Yeah.
As something that you're used to handling and you can swing around quite confidently,
Yeah,
but is now
absolutely.
going to do serious damage to
Yeah.
someone.
The issue with these comes when, if you're fighting on a battlefield with loads of peasants and you're fighting side by side with everyone, this swinging around probably isn't great, particularly where not everyone has head protection. Incredibly deadly, but potentially deadly to people on your own side.
With its mix of military and improvised weapons, the rebellion began to spread. On the same day Wat Tyler led his force into Canterbury, in Essex, rebels with axes and modified tools attacked Cressing Temple, looting and burning documents. The Essex rebels repeated the bonfire at Chelmsford and moved towards London. The group from Canterbury also headed in the direction of the capital, setting up camp on Blackheath. The peasants were now just a few miles from the wealthiest and largest city in England. They'd spent weeks secretly communicating from East Anglia to Kent using covert messengers and military-inspired codes. This was a coordinated approach by people who knew exactly what they were doing and who demanded justice. The capital was where their voices would be heard the loudest. London was about to face their wrath.
On the 12th of June, thousands of men and women poured into this open common land to the southeast of London. It must have been like a festival atmosphere, people full of ideas and excitement and hope. There must have been fires and music and voices exchanging thoughts on what was to come. Joanna Ferrer and others that we've met along the way all arrived on Blackheath, and they brought with them Sir John Newington, the constable of Rochester Castle that they'd taken hostage. As a man known to the king and the government, he was selected to go to them to deliver the rebels' demands.
Sir John left Blackheath and headed to the most formidable fortress in England, the Tower of London. The Tower was the representation of power and dominance over not just the city of London, but the whole of England. And inside was the kingdom's most valuable asset, the most important person in the land, the 14-year-old King Richard II. Sir John Newington informed him that the rebels meant him no harm and held him as their rightful king, but believed the realm of England had not been well governed by his uncles and by the clergy. As well as the young king, the Tower also held someone we've come across already, a man who was one of the most hated figures in England, Simon Sudbury. As Lord Chancellor, Sudbury was effectively head of the government and had a key role in enacting the third poll tax that had triggered the revolt. Although he just resigned the post, he was seen as a villain and a target by the rebels. Amongst others on the list of evildoers were Richard II's uncles, who had been in charge when the king was too young to rule by himself. Richard's early reign is complex, but someone who can help unpick the problems and the people is historian Helen Castor.
So by 1381, how long has Richard been King of England?
Richard had been king by this stage for 4 years, despite the fact that he was only 14. So he'd become king very young. It's the first time since the conquest that the crown has skipped a generation, and it means that England is facing a really long period of years with a king who, in effect, is too young to rule for himself.
And what kind of issues does a minority cause for the country?
In medieval England, the king's authority and the direction of the king's will is what makes the whole system work. So if you take the king out, in effect, if the king, as Richard was when he came to the throne, is 10, how do you get that consistent direction? Who makes the decisions?
And I think it's quite often seen as his uncles that were part of the problem. Is that right?
Rather than all of his uncles, I would say one of them. He has, at this point, 3 surviving uncles. It's John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, who is the issue. Gaunt was very ambitious, but it was an ambition driven by duty. He's trying to keep the whole thing going, but what people see when they look from the outside is a very powerful nobleman who seems to be out for his own ends, and that's the concern, that Gaunt might actually be trying to get power for himself, perhaps even get the throne for himself, rather than looking after the country until Richard is old enough.
So is John of Gaunt some kind of misunderstood, honourable guy?
I think John of Gaunt was a very honourable man. It didn't mean that he was without problems. He was very proud. He could be extremely haughty. He didn't take kindly at all to criticism and calls for reform, whether they come through the Commons in Parliament, such as in 1376, the Good Parliament, or in 1381, when it's a question of more popular resistance. He could respond in those circumstances very brutally, but his goal, I think, was to preserve and protect the authority of the crown for his nephew Richard, to whom he felt a great sense of responsibility.
And I suppose the problem in 1381 is that that brings him into direct conflict with those who are opposed to precisely what he represents.
Well, that's the thing, but also he wasn't here. He wasn't here in London. He was way up on the northern border, another part of his responsibilities being defence against the Scots. If one is inclined to feel sorry for John of Gaunt, it might be because he's spinning so many plates at the same time, trying to keep the whole show on the road. So he's too far away to be able to do anything about what's happening in and around London. And so his property, his family, including his son Henry, are all under threat.
And the 14-year-old Richard II, do we have any sense yet of his personality? What kind of teenager was he?
In one sense, it's difficult because we don't have the secret diary of Richard II, aged 13 3/4. I would so love it if we did. And we don't tend in this period to have private letters that would allow us to see behind the scenes of public politics. But I think we can pick up some clues. Richard believed he was special. Of course, he was special. He was the king. He wasn't wrong about that. But I think he didn't fully understand what came with the kind of special he was. That being king did mean that he'd been given God-given authority. He'd been crowned at the age of 10, anointed, changed from all other men. But what he didn't see were the responsibilities, the duties, the work that needed to go into it. And partly, I think, that's because he'd been wrapped in a very rarefied form of cotton wool for almost his entire life, because he was the precious heir, the one on whom England's future depended.
So can we see a government and a king that is pretty unprepared for what was happening in 1381?
I think it was a tremendous shock. I think conflict had been erupting in parliaments over how to fund a failing war. Because everyone's eyes had been focused within government on Parliament being the problem, the idea that suddenly the ordinary people out in the towns and the shires might have something to say about it, I think that was a tremendous shock.
On the 13th of June, the chaos was beginning to get out of control. It was now time for Richard and his advisors to act.
Young King Richard agreed to meet the rebels. The site was set at Rotherhithe, halfway between Blackheath and the Tower of London. On the morning of the 13th of June, young Richard was rowed out of the Tower of London and along the Thames towards the meeting. There must have been so much excitement at Rotherhithe as people gathered. The king was actually coming. But then, as the royal barge came close to Rotherhithe, they were shocked to be confronted by 10,000 raucous rebels. That shock, though, would quickly turn to fear of what might happen to the young Richard. The Earl of Salisbury ordered the barge to be turned around. Amongst the crowd gathered on the shore, fury rose to a fever pitch, and the crowd gathered snapped. If the king and his advisors had felt threatened before, they were about to know real terror. England was about to burn.
In the next episode, we'll follow the explosive violence that erupted over the next few days, investigating more unseen documents uncovered by the People of 1381 project. Exploring the attack on London from the Savoy to the Tower, where we'll find Richard II taking direct action.
I think for Richard, there's a real sense that finally someone is recognising that he should be in charge and he's the one to sort this out.
Confusion, fire and murder will engulf the capital, and we'll discover how the revolt spread across England. This was just the beginning. Now pride reigns as prize, covetousness is held wise, lechery without shame, gluttony without blame, envy reigns with treason, and sloth is in high season. Now is time. The Tower of London is one of the most fortified strongholds in England, impenetrable for nearly 1,000 years, apart from on one day.
On the 14th of June 1381, hundreds of men and women from all across England marched on it, and they walked straight through the gates.
But how did this happen? How could the rebels take down this powerhouse of medieval royal authority?
This group of so-called peasants met no resistance from the guards, apparently greeting them and shaking their hands as brothers. But violence would soon erupt. It would end in one of the most riotous summers in England's history and the deaths of two of the most important men in the kingdom. But how did it come to this?
We left the revolting peasants at Rotherhithe on the 13th of June 1381. By then, they'd grown in numbers, collecting insurgents from across unruly East Anglia and troublesome Kent, as well as unsettled Essex, and gathering around London. At Rotherhithe, Richard II had failed to come ashore to talk to them. The rebels were erupting with rage and ready to get their justice, no matter the cost. After the abandoned meeting on the 13th of June, the members of the uprising poured across London Bridge. Though it looked quite different to the current bridge in 1381. We can see an amazing model of the old bridge at St Magnus the Martyr Church. This model recreates how London Bridge looked in the medieval period, full of all the hustle and bustle of an entranceway to the biggest city in the kingdom. It was cluttered with houses, shops, defensive gateways, and even a church. If the rebels were really just peasants with only violence and destruction on their minds, surely the bottleneck at London Bridge would have been the perfect place to stop them. They could simply have raised the drawbridge in the middle, but nobody did stop them, and they moved over the only crossing of the River Thames.
The Londoners welcomed the rebels in 1381. They weren't all that different from themselves. Many of them shared the same objectives as the rebellion. London, too, had a thriving underworld scene that made it the ideal place for serfs to run away to, and the city would invariably help those seeking their freedoms.
It's a reminder that these weren't the rabble of peasants we're usually presented with, but people from across the spectrum of countryside society. As they crossed into the City of London, the mob broke open prisons in Southwark and targeted offices and homes of lawyers as they moved into the city to destroy more records. Violence was spreading throughout the capital like wildfire. The people at the top, the targets of the rebels' burning hatred, were growing fearful. Surely they would aim for the head of the realm, the king. But he wasn't their target. Criticising the king was outright treason, and so they directed their fury at his advisors. Their next stop was the London home of one of the wealthiest and most hated men in England, the young king's uncle, John of Gaunt.
Gaunt was blamed for crippling taxation in England, taxes that were being used to fund his failures abroad. The rebels considered him one of those most to blame for the chaos in the country, yet he lived in one of the most luxurious homes in England. The next target had to be his house, the Savoy Palace.
Today, the Savoy is one of the most exclusive hotels in the world, and back in 1381, it was still the height of luxury.
The contemporary chronicler Henry Knighton said that Gaunt's palace was so full of treasure, of gold and silver and jewels and cash, that 5 carts wouldn't have been enough to take it all away. But that wasn't what the rebels were interested in. They set the palace on fire and they watched it burn. 30 of the rebels became trapped in Gaunt's wine cellar, and their cries were reportedly heard from the smouldering wreckage of the building for days. To their enemies, they were an example of the reckless violence of the rebels. But their leaders insisted they were here for noble reasons, not criminal ones. As their numbers swelled, though, it became increasingly difficult to maintain control. It was at the Savoy, too, that one of the rebels we've already met would emerge as one of the leaders of the movement, Joanna Ferrer.
We last saw her in Blackheath, but Joanna has now moved with the revolt through London to the Savoy. The research of the People of 1381 project is shedding new light on this chaotic scene, uncovering what really happened and why, and who was involved. The wealth of documents tell a story that's very different from the well-known accounts. They've uncovered that out of the 520 people charged with attacking the Savoy, only 3 were women: Isabella and Matilda Brembele, and our ringleader, Joanna Ferrer. The project has been digging into newly found documents that track Joanna's prosecution in court. It's thrilling to be in the midst of these medieval legal documents, and to investigate further, I'm meeting back up with Helen.
Joanna Ferrer is someone that we've met at Rochester, and she makes it to Blackheath with the rebels, and she's in this document which relates to the burning of the Savoy Palace. What does this say she did?
Yeah, so she's come from Kent. She's here in the records of the court being indicted for her actions.
This document is an indictment paper and states how Joanna, wife of John Ferrer of Rochester in the county of Kent, went as the chief perpetrator and leader of a great society of rebellious wrongdoers from Kent on Thursday the 13th of June 1381 to the Savoy, and as an enemy of the king burned the said manor. She seized a chest containing £1,000, and then she put the said chest into a boat on the Thames and made off with it all the way to Southwark, where she divided the gold between herself and others.
Her name is the first mentioned in the indictment, and it says she led the men into the attack on the Savoy.
It's incredible in so many ways. I mean, she's accused of stealing money in a revolt which was quite careful to position itself as not being about stealing riches from the wealthy, that this was about reform of the government. But I'm really struck here that she's listed with her husband, John, but it's Joanna and John. It's not John and Joanna. She's the first name.
Yeah, she seems to be this really exceptional woman who they are saying is a ringleader, rather than using this temperate language of saying she helped or she persuaded, which I think is carefully crafted kind of narrative.
And what happens to her in court?
Oh, well, eventually the jury acquit her. So it's really interesting. She's done all this dramatic event. So I do wonder whether, again, we've got this cultural thing of juries not wanting to indict women because it's not part of that cultural narrative about women and their role.
From the Savoy Palace, Joanna and the rebels moved on to Clerkenwell, the London headquarters of the Knights Hospitaller. It was set alight and burned so completely that it was said to have smouldered for 7 days. Then they broke open Newgate Prison.
After just one day, the 13th of June, London was burning. Plumes of smoke rose from across the city. The young king now insisted, or his advisors conceded, that a meeting had to take place. It was arranged for the following day, the 14th of June, here at Mile End, a spot on the outskirts of London that takes its name from being 1 mile from Aldgate in the old city walls. The events of the 14th of June would only serve to deepen the chaos and the confusion, and Jean Froissart has left us a detailed account of how the meeting took place.
Jean Froissart was born in 1337 and was a French-speaking author and historian. He's best known for his work simply entitled Chronicles, which contains beautiful illuminated images, including some depicting the revolt. Froissart describes the events at Mile End as Richard II addresses the people, his nobles and knights watching on. Although the precise way in which the revolt was organised is unknown, here at Mile End, one man emerges as the leader of the movement.
Wat Tyler emerged from the crowd to issue the rebels' demands. They asked first that all of those around Richard who they believed served him with evil intent should be arrested and tried for treason. Richard agreed, insisting only that the due process of the law should be followed.
Then, Tyler demanded an end to serfdom in England. Henceforward, no man should be a serf, nor make homage or any type of service to any lord, but should give 4d for an acre of land. Froissart added, they also asked that no one should serve any man except at his own will and by means of a regular covenant.
This would be utterly revolutionary. It would change the fabric of English society forever. As Richard rode out amongst the rebels, Froissart records him asking them, "You good people, I am your king. What lack you? What will you say?" To which they replied, "We will that you make us free forever, ourselves, our heirs, and our lands, and that we be called no more bond or so reputed."
In medieval Europe, bonded labour was a form of slavery in which people had to work for a landlord or the person who lent them money to repay their debts.
To our peasant shock, Richard agreed immediately. He set clerks to work creating the documents that would make them free men. Anyone who waited could receive letters patent from the king. Imagine the open-mouthed shock of all of our rebels. Job done, or was it?
But how did the 14-year-old Richard feel about everything that was going on? He'd been under the thumb of his uncles, mainly John of Gaunt, and his other advisors, like Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Robert Hales, the Treasurer. I'm meeting back up with Helen Castor to try to understand the young king's part in all of this.
Well, it's such a big day for him. He's being very brave. This is not a straightforward situation at all. But it's also a real opportunity for him. He's looking at the men who are running his government and thinking, well, you're saying I'm king, but when do I actually get to do something? And that's what the rebels are asking too. They hate the men who've been running Richard's government, and their answer to their problems is that they're looking to their king. On the road to London, they have a password, one of the chroniclers tells us. They're stopping people and saying, "With whom hold you?" And the right answer is, "With King Richard and the true commons." So I think for Richard, there's a real sense that finally, someone is recognising that he should be in charge and he's the one to sort this out.
And it must have been a real moment for this 14-year-old boy to be called as the champion for all of these people who call him king. Do you think he shared the rebels' desire to shed that layer of repression around him to gain his freedom?
From a very different perspective, I think he did. Richard was never, throughout his life, good at seeing anything from anyone else's point of view. So I'm not suggesting for a moment that he was looking at the rebels, looking at his people and thinking, I want to help them. It's not that kind of thing. It's very much more, yes, I should have the authority that is mine. Why don't I have control of my own government? So in that sense, it's not that they have a meeting of minds, a meeting of political minds. It's more that part of the rebels' agenda meets the whole of Richard's.
And given that they have this shared desire, a shared end, even if it comes from different motivations, when Richard agrees quite so readily to abolish serfdom in front of all of his people, do you think he meant it? Did he want to do that?
I think there are two things going on there. One is that the advisors around him desperately need to close the rebellion down, get the rebels out of London, regain control of the capital. In a sense, they are prepared to say anything. For Richard, I think it's a bit different. If his nobles were thinking, well, we'll just say yes now and we'll sort it out later, of course we don't actually mean that. But for Richard, why wouldn't he mean that? Serfdom means that some of his subjects are under the direct control of some of his landowners. They don't have direct access to him as king, to royal justice, the royal courts. When we hear in some of the accounts that the rebels are saying they want only one law and one lordship, it's the king's law, the king's lordship they want. That sounds pretty good to Richard.
Whilst the Mile End meeting had been tense, it had been peaceful. But elsewhere in the city, violence persisted, and for the only time in its history, on the 14th of June 1381, the Tower of London was breached.
This moment is often seen as the ultimate expression of the brutish thuggery of those rebels. But how could they possibly get into the Tower of London quite so easily? Our chronicler, Jean Froissart, explains it this way. The king had ridden out to meet the rebels at Mile End. The tower's drawbridges and portcullis gates had not been raised behind him, and a mob of at least 400 men stormed the castle. The men-at-arms guarding the tower put up no resistance, and the peasants shook their hands as brothers and stroked their beards in a friendly fashion. This idea of deception and trickery, of slipping into the king's fortress while he's away at Mile End negotiating in good faith, has stuck. But it's just as likely that people arrived here with letters patent from Richard that allowed them access, perhaps even warrants for the arrest of some of his ministers. After all, that's what he'd just agreed to at Mile End. That would make far more sense of being able to get into the Tower of London that easily.
They entered through the gates, flooded along Water Lane, and made straight for the White Tower.
The rebels crashed through the tower's rooms. In one, they found the king's mother, Joan of Kent, reputedly one of the most beautiful women in England. Froissart records at this moment that the rebels arrogantly lay and sat and joked on the king's bed, while several asked the king's mother to kiss them.
This must have been a frightening experience for Joan. Stories of this sort of threat and of incidents of sexual assault amongst tax officers have long been associated with the Peasants Revolt. So far, research into the 1381 rebellion hasn't uncovered any evidence of sexual assault or rape as part of the revolt or its causes, but it's impossible to be certain how many women may have suffered as Joan did, or worse.
Fortunately, the rebels moved on to continue their hunt.
Two other people close to Richard didn't escape. They'd sought refuge here in the White Tower's chapel of St. John the Evangelist.
As the rebels entered the chapel, they found their real prey. Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Robert Hales, the treasurer and leader of the Knights Hospitaller.
They were found right here, where members of the government had gathered to seek sanctuary from the mob that hunted them. Simon Sudbury had recently resigned as Chancellor. Hales, as the Treasurer, was held responsible for the heavy taxation and financial failings. As the two most senior members of Richard's government, these men, above all, were blamed for the oppression of the ordinary people. The rebels found them and showed them no mercy.
Robert and Simon were dragged outside and executed immediately. Froissart records the moment in his chronicles, and we're told that Simon Sudbury was taken to Tower Hill, where it took 8 strokes of the sword to remove his head from his body.
Hale's fate was similar. He too was executed by the rebels. Simon's head was put on a spike on London Bridge as though he was a traitor. It was a shocking disregard for two of the most senior men in government. But it wasn't just the people the rebels saw as villains who found themselves under attack at the Tower. Many other people got caught up in this chaotic scene as Londoners began to do exactly what Richard had told them to do at Mile End, to come to him directly with their complaints so that he could rectify all of their legal problems. One of the people swept up in all of this is Marjorie Tawney.
This is a really interesting petition of a woman called Marjorie Tawney, and she's not actually a rebel herself, but she gets caught up in the events on that Friday in London.
This document states how Marjorie, widow of Thomas Tawney, states that on Corpus Christi, during the last insurrection, a proclamation was made that anyone with an action, title, or right to recover any debts or inheritances should come to the King at the Tower of London with their evidence, and justice would be done to them.
So she and her eldest son make their way to the Tower. They're pushing, elbowing through the crowds to try and get to the Tower to present their case. And the case is nothing to do with the revolt. It's just that she says she has money owed to her from the order called the Poor Knights of St. George in Windsor Castle, where her husband was. She's a widow. Her husband died a few years previously. So she takes her eldest son and marches off to the Tower to demand this money. And she gets to the Tower, but then in this petition, she says that they don't make it, they don't present the petition on the Friday. So she decides to go back again on the Saturday. She makes another attempt, and it's apparently successful that she gets her petition through. And it all looks good for a bit because they say that they will grant her the money that she's owed, and that's all fine.
It seemed to be going well for Marjorie. The direct access to the King's justice promised by Richard had worked, but her situation soon turned dark.
But then there's a sort of a sad turn to the story in that the day at the Tower on the Friday where the Archbishop and the Treasurer are killed, her opponents, as it were, from Windsor Castle, they say that Marjorie and her son were actually involved in those murders, and they say, they should be arrested and put on trial.
The document continues, and the Dean of the College of Windsor was ordered to pay her. However, he had both her sons arrested and beat the elder so badly that he died.
Marjorie flees to sanctuary. We don't know what happens to her in the end, but we do know that years later, her younger son is still going through the courts petitioning for this money from his father.
I was going to say, good on Marjorie, that she's making her point and trying to get this money back, although it obviously has a really sad ending for her. But it must have been quite exciting that suddenly she's going to get access to the King to get the ultimate, centre of justice is going to solve this problem for her. Yeah. But then you've got the frightening moment of trying to get through London in plumes of smoke and watching palaces burn all around you and presumably violence going on about you while you're trying to push your way through. So it must have been equal measures exciting and frightening.
Yeah, I think so. And I think what's interesting is that her account here sort of contradicts the Chronicle narrative, which says that the King and his key advisors were holed up in the Tower, and they're trying to tell people to disperse and leave London to kind of reduce the immediate threat on London. But she says she's had a proclamation saying everyone should come to the Tower and they'll receive justice. So there's kind of two conflicting narratives of what was going on that Friday in London.
Yeah, but interesting to see how women were able to harness the opportunity of the Peasants Revolt.
She was no rebel, but Marjorie Tawney's story can tell us so much about what was going on. Even those who didn't actively join the revolt had their grievances. They could articulate their case, and they were willing to stand before the king to make their claims. Marjorie took King Richard at his word. She bravely set out from her house amidst the violence, the flames, and the choking smoke to make her own life a little bit better. Marjorie was no thug, but clearly the aims of the rebels spoke to her and many others.
But along with the death and destruction, there is an intriguing story of someone who escaped the rebels' bloodlust as the events at the Tower unfolded. It returns a familiar name to the story and is a vital moment for England's future.
And there's an interesting incident with the Ferrers a little bit later as well, isn't there, during the reign of Henry IV.
Yeah, so the husband and wife double act. Nearly 20 years later, John Ferrer is again in court, accused of treason again, this time against the then King Henry IV. And he's meant to have been involved in this plot which we call the Epiphany Rising. And apparently he's in court in Oxford Castle, and apparently the king is there present in the court, and he says that he's going to give him a pardon because John Ferrer saved the life of Henry IV.
The future King Henry IV was 14 in 1381. Known as Henry Bolingbroke after the castle in which he was born, he was John of Gaunt's son, the heir of the owner of the Savoy Palace. He would have been a target for the rebels and might have raised a good ransom for the mob if they were the evil villains they were painted as. But John and Joanna surprisingly seem to have saved Henry's life by hiding this future king in a cupboard as the rebels stormed the Tower.
And Henry IV says, one good turn deserves another, and so I'm going to pardon John Ferrer for this action.
There seem to be serial wrong'uns who get away with it every single time.
Yeah, I mean, it might be the case that John Ferrer is unlucky that in 1400, when he comes up court again, apparently those people are a lot of sort of scapegoating. So maybe they're remembering him here and then trying to get him in 1400.
We only know about this story because of the incredible research within the treasure trove of documents connected to the revolt, linking some of the most famous medieval figures directly to the rebellious peasants. Outside the Tower, things were beginning to come apart at the seams. As the chaos continued, another meeting between the king and those who'd come to London was arranged here at Smithfields, the site of a meat market for over 800 years. It was an ominous spot, one built for blood and butchery. The rebels and Richard would come face to face here on June the 15th. Froissart shows us an army gathered here at Smithfield, wearing matching armour like a uniform. Froissart portrays the rebels as a dangerous, violent force that threatened the establishment. In reality, they were unlikely to be armoured like this, but these were not the peasants history has long imagined.
Our rebels were gathered here wearing their day clothes, armed with little more than field tools on a long pole, as they waited for the king and his forces to arrive. After everything that had happened at the Tower, everyone was on edge. Imagine the fear growing amongst the rebels as they heard the king and his ranks of knights in armour approaching, the clanking getting louder and louder as they got closer along the road. When they finally came together, Wat Tyler stepped forward, as he had done the day before, to deliver the remainder of the rebels' demands. Richard asked what was stopping them from going home. Wat Tyler asked for some reforms of the church, an end to monopolies, and some legal changes that they felt would make England a fairer place to live. I wonder whether Richard's easy acceptance the day before had caught them off guard and prevented them from delivering the rest of their demands. Cautious of the growing list, Richard promised to do all that he could to help the rebels.
Descriptions of what happened next are muddled and contradictory.
Whether Tyler grew annoyed or frustrated or just spoke to the king too familiarly is unclear. Some sources say he made a grab for the reins of Richard's horse. Others that he spoke to the king without due respect. Whatever happened, the Mayor of London, William Woolworth, stepped forward with his dagger and stabbed Wat Tyler. Woolworth squire Ralph Standish then ran him through with a sword. Wat Tyler, the leader of the Peasants Revolt, lay dead in a pool of blood on the floor here at Smithfield.
This plaque was left in memory of that fateful day and uses the words of the radical preacher John Ball to commemorate 1381.
There was stunned silence at Smithfield. It was broken by the young king. From his horse, Richard called out, "You shall have no captain but me. I am your king. Be all in rest and peace." In the silence that followed, the tension only grew. Richard's advisors and his knights must have been wary and on edge. The young king was vulnerable and the crowd was enraged. Richard's life hung in the balance for a few moments until suddenly the crowd began to disperse, taking the hint that it was time to go home. Richard and his advisors must have breathed sighs of relief.
London had been consumed by fire and violence. The genuine desire and heartfelt plea for a fairer world that had brought so many people to the capital was drowned out by the chaos. England had come within a hair's breadth of a seismic revolution. Wat Tyler had galvanised an unhappy populace behind an idea, and he'd led them to deliver their vision to the king himself. He'd blazed a trail that many had followed. Would there have been a Peasants' Revolt without his leadership? Maybe. But now that Wat was gone, what would become of the ideas he had championed? The death of Tyler and the collapse of the rebels' cause at Smithfield is often seen as the end of the Peasants' Revolt. In the final episode, we'll explore the impact of these fiery days in June 1381 on the rest of the country.
Norfolk was more involved in the Peasants' Revolt than any other county.
And we meet some of the individuals key to the continuation of the revolt.
What's interesting about him, maybe he was one of the first ever Billy Braggs of his generation.
As people find themselves arrested for exercising their newly won rights, we'll discover what became of Simon Sudbury after his death, and head to Norfolk to investigate the last violent stand of the uprising, the only pitched battle of the Peasants' Revolt.
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.